This episode of The Biggest Table is brought to you in part by Wild Goose Coffee. Since 2008, Wild Goose has sought to build better communities through coffee. And for our listeners, Wild Goose is offering a special promotion of 20% off a one-time order using the code TABLE at checkout. To learn more and to order coffee, please visit wildgoosecoffee.com. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Hannah Miller-Keene. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Biggest Table. I am your host, Andrew Camp, and in this podcast, we explore the table, food, eating, and hospitality as an arena for experiencing God's love and our love for one another. And today, I'm joined by Hannah Miller-Keene. Hannah is a priest and writer in the Anglican tradition. She has been a campus minister among conservatory musicians, an apartment minister in urban high-rise, and a parish pastor in large and small churches. She currently serves as the Associate Rector at the Vine Anglican Church in Western North Carolina. She is a contributing writer for Christianity Today and Holy Post Media, and is the author of Feasting on Hope, How God Sets a Table in the Wilderness. Hannah holds a Bachelor of Arts in Music from Westminster Choir College and a Master of Arts in Religion from Redeemer Seminary. She is currently being schooled in the minutia of Star Wars and other galactic battles between good and evil by her 3 kids. So thanks for joining me today, Hannah. Really enjoyed your book and excited. Always love conversations that revolve around the Eucharist.
Oh, me too. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. And I appreciate you reaching out because I had heard your book, and when you reached out and just really explained more of it, I was like, no, this feels like a great fit. And I always want to help enlarge in people's imaginations for what the Lord's table, the Eucharist, communion, whatever words we want to use for it, can really form us into the people God would have us. So,
Yeah. Well, likewise, when I saw a podcast called The Biggest Table, I was like, I have to know more. So,
yeah.
yeah.
So here we are, and you write in early on in your book that we need a bigger frame for our grief. And so your book really does unpack the Lord's table in the midst of the grief you've experienced and how that coming to this table has, reframed your imagination. And so what do you mean by we need a bigger frame for our grief?
Well, I grew up in an evangelical tradition that really emphasized God's ability to answer prayers and to perform miracles. And I still believe both of those things. But my father died of cancer when I was a young teenager, despite our fervent prayers. And so I really needed just a more expansive theological framework than just pray really hard and hope for the best, because sometimes we don't get the answers to our prayers that we're expecting. And I would say kind of into my teen years, I felt a little bit isolated from the community of faith because my story hadn't gone according to the sort of Christian formula. And so finding that sense of belonging again in the community of faith around the Lord's Supper was very healing for me because it helped me realize actually our experiences of unmet longing belong at the table. They are part of our faith. They're a feature, not a flaw, because we believe in a story that isn't over yet. We're still waiting for the renewal of all things. And so it's actually very important that we bring our grief with us to the table, so to speak.
I love that. Yeah, because I've not heard many people talk about grief I've not heard many people talk about the table as an avenue for bringing our grief. And so how did you arrive at the Eucharist as seeing it as a place that could hold your grief? Because like me, you were raised evangelical where the Lord's table was maybe de-emphasized or pushed, if we made time for it if the sermon didn't go long.
Right. Right.
And so how did the Eucharist then begin to take shape as a center for your grief versus an add-on?
Well, it started when I began receiving communion every week at my church in seminary. And I was crying every week in church, and I didn't know why.
Hmm.
And so as I began to sit with that and reflect on it, I realized, for me, a lot of my grief centers around family and familial belonging. And so it was this experience of coming to a family table where I felt very vulnerable and kind of exposed as a fatherless
Hmm.
person in my spirit, coming to the table of the Father. Um, it really kind of pushed on me where it hurt,
Hmm.
but it was welcoming. It was, you belong here and you are a daughter. So in a way, it was healing of my grief. And yet at the same time, in my tradition, the Anglican tradition, part of the Eucharistic liturgy is also the celebrant says, as we partake of these elements, um, one day bring us with all of your saints to the fullness of your kingdom. And so there was this sense of longing, even at the table, the sense that we're just getting a taste of the fellowship and the family that's coming. And so I realized my grief, and all of our grief, I think, can be both healed but also stoked at the Lord's table, because there's a sense in which Jesus feeds us now in the
Hmm.
gospel, but also which he says, and let this just whet your appetite because I'm
Right.
coming to, this full feast.
Yeah. I love that, you're using the language of wet your taste buds. I've always thought about the Lord's table as an amuse bouche to the kingdom. As
Yes.
a professional chef, the amuse bouche is something that enlivens the palate, and gets you ready
Hmm.
for the full meal. It's supposed to awaken, you know, your senses and get you ready. Um,
Yes.
and so, yeah, when you say, it's that already not yet aspect that we long for, and so that table helps us name our desires, and helps us reshape what we long for, hopefully, in ways that few other things may can.
Yes. Yeah, I love that. And C.S. Lewis in The Weight of Glory talks about, I think he says, like, the scent of a flower we've not yet seen, or
Mm.
the tune of a song we've not yet heard. And there's this sense of longing for a far off country. And I think the Lord's Supper can be kind of a taste of the food from that far off country. We sense that it's real and we want it, but it's still to come.
Right. And so your book really helps us recenter the Eucharist. Um, and yet many of us are in traditions that don't have, if we're not in an Anglican, Episcopal, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox tradition, we may not have the Eucharist as a central element of our worship. And so what do many of us miss by not having the Lord's Supper as sort of the center or the climax of our weekly gathering?
I mean, I think so. A lot of people who don't celebrate it weekly say, well, we don't want to cheapen it or make it just feel rote. But I think what they miss out on is the sense that it is kind of rote. It's daily bread.
Yeah.
And it doesn't always have to be this big special thing. It's just a reminder that we're literally fed by Christ when we come into his presence, and nourished to be sent out then into the world on mission. But I would also say that even just pedagogically, I think sermons are great. Obviously, I believe in sermons. But ritual and embodied practices, communal embodied practices,
Hmm.
really help us to get the same information by means of a different avenue.
Right.
And I think that's really a large part of what happened for me, is I was starting to learn the gospel through the practice, in a different way than I had through reading or listening or, formal study. So I think there's a lot to be said about just doing it.
There's a couple of things you touched on. One, that something we do, um, we repeat. The Eucharist is something we repeat on a weekly basis, whereas baptism's a one-time thing. And so, what is it like? And you point that out in your book. And like, what is it about the Eucharist that needs to be repeated versus a baptism that is a one-time event? Because like part of me thinks like, well, I need to be reminded of my death to Christ and being raised with Christ. Yet my baptism is a once deal,
Right.
whereas the Eucharist, we're invited to the table constantly.
Yeah. Well, I think theologically, I mean, if we're thinking about the church as a family, you're born once, but then you come to the table, the family table, every day.
Right.
So at the table, we're learning how to be brothers and sisters, sons and daughters. We're being fed ongoingly. I also think that, the talk about our appetites, we're constantly looking for nourishment, satisfaction, fulfillment, and we're constantly looking in all the wrong places. And so, from a formation perspective, coming to the table again and again is a chance to remind ourselves, okay, Jesus is the bread of life. He alone can satisfy our great longing. And I'm going to direct my hunger towards him again and again.
I love that because, you touched on it earlier too, of this embodied practice that, when Jesus asks us to remember him and remember the incarnation, it's not in the abstract, but we remember through chewing, through sipping, through swallowing. And you even write that the sacraments convey his love to our senses. And so how unpack that for us, I guess. Or, what is it about the sacraments that help us, that we need to be reminded of our embodiedness versus a sermon which may just appeal cognitively to who we are?
Right. Which again, I don't mean to diminish the cognitive, but if you think about, our precognitive selves, like nonverbal infants can still give and receive love through the senses, through eye contact, through touch, and even maybe in our old age. I mean, I remember being really struck by taking communion to people in skilled nursing facilities when I was training for ordination, and how even after they really were verbal, the person would come in with the clerical collar and they would just like open their mouths in their beds, like, just like, give me the communion. And it was like they still had a way of communing with God that, outlived their ability to maybe form words. And that really struck me.
No, and when I was reading your book and preparing, I was thinking, I'm always drawn to Luke 24 and the road to Emmaus. In your book talking about grief, and you talk about two disciples stricken with grief, and Jesus meets them on these road, and he gives them the best sermon that could ever have been preached that we don't get access to. But then they don't recognize Jesus until he breaks the bread.
Yes.
And I'm curious, like, as you've thought through that passage, like, how has that informed your understanding of grief, and also then meeting Jesus? Just because I obviously it's my favorite passage, and so it's formative for me, and I'm always curious how it might have formed your imagination.
Yeah, I really wanted to use that passage in my book, but it didn't. I don't know. It didn't present itself in any of the chapters that I worked on. But I mean, it's such a Eucharistic story. And I love how Jesus accompanies them and he lets them talk first. I think that's a good example of how God comes alongside us in our disillusionment. And he doesn't just get to the punchline, but he commits to being with us on the journey. And then he feeds us. And, that moment then connects them back to their sense of longing. Didn't our hearts burn within us? But we didn't quite understand until he did the moves, he broke the bread and distributed it.
Right. And in that moment, they thought they were going to be the host and Jesus is the guest, and everything's reversed. And you even point out in your book that in hospitality and in communion, we, the blurred lines of guest and host quickly show up. And so, like, how a lot of us love to be the host, because it's a position of power or it's a position of comfort versus being a guest. And so like how can the Eucharist train ourselves to be good guests in a world that may not be always so hospitable?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. I do think we, like you said, we don't like to feel like we're not the person in the position of power.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that really undid me when I started receiving communion weekly was the whole empty hands bit. You come forward and you don't have anything to contribute except yourself.
Right.
And so I think allowing ourselves to get in touch with that and to feel the scariness of it, um, and to realize that we're kind of making ourselves vulnerable before God and saying, "I'm hungry. Will
Mm-hmm.
you feed me? I'm empty. Will you accept me?" And then marveling at how God then makes himself vulnerable in return by saying, "This is my body given for you," I think can be a really healing and a really um just a reframing sort of way of even being in the world, off learning how to offer ourselves as a gift and receive the other as a gift, as opposed to um, showing up with our accomplishments or, like you said, our sense of power.
Right. I You made that phrase, that Jesus shows up as the vulnerable savior in the communion, and it's not a word I've heard, and it caught me. But I think it's so true. Is obviously Jesus hanging on the cross is a very vulnerable act, but him to show up vulnerable to us, to feed us, to meet us in these longings, certainly has the power to reshape our posture to the world. Uh,
Yeah, because I mean, vulnerable just means woundable,
hmm,
right? And he took on a body and became wounded for us, in that kind of self-offering and the sense that we can reject him. We can say thanks but no thanks,
yeah,
or
right.
I'll have this plus my other things that are really more important to me.
Yeah.
And yet he continues to offer himself and to be generous.
Hmm,
I think is really convicting.
yeah. And so as we take communion, we're shaped by it. Our griefs are presented to Jesus, our desires. And so then how does that shape, not only ourselves, but how does that shape us into community? Because I think there is, Paul's warnings to the Corinthians were all about, hey, who you are as a community as you celebrate this. And so often it's a me and Jesus moment, but
Mm.
where might the community come into play as we think about this table in a wilderness?
Yeah. So Peter Lightheart says, and I quote him in the book, we're often really interested in the zoom lens on communion. What's happening to the bread and the wine? Who gets to do it?
Yeah.
Who gets to receive it? And those things are important, but we shouldn't also neglect the wide angle lens of communion, the
Hmm,
sociological aspect of the fact that at this meal, God is making a family and
hmm,
he's reordering society. And, we see that really maybe more obviously in the early church when we think about slaves and free men and Jews and Gentiles and rich and poor learning how to eat together and have this kind of equitable community in the ancient world, which was so revolutionary.
hmm.
So what would it look like today for Republicans and Democrats to, think
Yeah.
of each other as brothers and sisters? I mean, that's can be a hard pill to swallow depending on which Republicans or Democrats
Right.
right?
Yeah.
But to think, well, they're in some sense my equal
Hmm.
and my brother and my sister. And my love for Jesus is directly related to how I treat them in the body, in relationship. Am I neglecting those who are less well off than I am in the church, or vice versa? I think there's a lot to really think about in terms of how we do community based on the meal that Jesus is hosting for all of us.
And so to make it personal, like how have you wrestled as somebody who offers communion weekly to God's people? Like, you know, these people, you see what they maybe post on social media. Like, how do you wrestle in your own soul, or how do you posture yourself so that you can freely offer still to people you may, in your humanly aspect or, fleshly aspect, want to withhold sometimes?
I'll say two things. The first of which is, I have not been deeply hurt by congregants per
Okay.
se. I see congregants come who've hurt each other. And it's really meaningful to see them coming and to believe truly that I'm offering each of them, God is offering each of them the grace that they need to be sustained in the fellowship that they're desperately trying, they're grasping for. Our communion can feel so flimsy in our human perspective, but God is on the other end of that line,
right?
Holding us together. And so that's really meaningful. I have been deeply hurt by other clergy and other pastors. And so for me, exploring communion through the lens of 1 Corinthians 11 and those who eat and drink in an unworthy manner because of how they've treated other Christians, I think is actually really comforting to think that even our leaders who maybe are in that position of power and they're not repentant of their sins towards the body, Jesus himself will hold them accountable in the meal that they're eating and drinking judgment on themselves. And so, there's a sense of accountability kind of baked into this meal, and that the leaders are not excluded from that.
It's interesting. Yeah. Because what does it mean to still just extend the fellowship and let Jesus, I am called to extend Jesus to people, even when I don't feel like it, or even if I feel hurt by them. And so to let Jesus deal with them. That's an interesting way to look at it. That's challenging, but also comforting, like you said.
Yeah, because historically, the practice of reconciliation would have happened before communion.
Right.
So we're supposed to be going to those people who've hurt us and working it out, before we come to the table together. But a lot of times we try to do that and the other person's like, I didn't do anything wrong, that's all your problem. And so that reconciliation can't happen, even if maybe you've done everything in your power. And so at that point to say, well, God is still involved in that situation, and I can extend peace and reconciliation as far as it depends on me.
Right.
And yet there's a sense in which, those who are unrepentant eat and drink judgment on themselves. I don't know exactly what that means.
Yeah. Right. Likewise.
Yes. And it's sobering. It's humbling, to think that could be me. And so that leads me to repentance,
Yeah. Because it's not, I remember being in youth group and, hearing, well, before you take communion, make sure you're right with God. And it always felt like I had to clean up before coming to the table. Like,
right.
You think of the 50s dinner scenes of, like, it's, like everybody's dressed in their best. And so I got to come to, Sunday table at church with my best clothes on. I can't come poor and wretched as I am. And, and yet, like, what does that mean as, how to be repentant and yet still come knowing I need forgiveness on a daily, hourly basis.
Right.
Has been challenging for me to think through, because I'm like, wait, no, I don't need to clean up my act to come to the table. to receive Jesus anew, but I also can't come unrepentant. And so there's a tension there, I think, that needs to,
Right. Yes. Yeah, I think tension is a good word. And that's one I try to hold throughout the book.
Mm-hmm.
I do believe, as a pastor, that the sacrament is a means of grace. And so absolutely people who are struggling with sin, dysfunction, that's all of us.
Yeah.
We need to come begging for God's help, and expecting to receive it.
Mm-hmm.
But also we should come with an open heart to be convicted of the ways that maybe we're sinning against his body in the community and ready to make it right. Or at least ready to say, Lord, help me get what I need to make it right. Sometimes reconciliation takes years, but we can come with that posture of saying, I want to be about this because you're about this. And so help me.
Yeah, and then it brings me to a point too of like, as we think about the table and we think about just even injustice in the world, like how, because you write that the economy of the kingdom is Eucharistic. And so like, how does coming to the table then inform how we view, society's sins, or, how we view, maybe for me, it's food inequality. Like how might the Eucharist shape our imaginations for thinking about bigger picture or bigger societal ills that, many of us are feeling in this current moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with this generous and miraculous abundance that God gives. And, that goes all the way back to his Old Testament covenant with the people of Israel who left Egypt. Egypt was the world superpower and they controlled all the resources.
Yeah.
But God said, I don't need that to feed my people. And then he made bread for them in the desert, and they still tried to hoard the bread because they didn't believe that it would be there the next day. And, as a teenager, I grew up with some food insecurity and I like hoarded food under my bed because I was like, I want to save this for myself.
Yeah.
But I think, and trusting in God's abundance as a Christian can feel very like wishful thinking or like a convenience for rich people to say.
Mm-hmm.
So what does it look like when you are actually food insecure or starving? I think there's something prophetic about it because there is a sense in which there is still injustice in the world and there is scarcity, but the world is also being made new. And so some of it, I think, is believing what's to come and hoping for that and trusting in that, even if we don't see it in the short term. And also, participating in that to the extent that God calls us to, in terms of like relieving food insecurity of others and not hoarding what we have, but saying, I want to participate in this otherworldly economy and I want to give more than I think I can give because I'm not afraid of needing to, store up for my own rainy days, but I'm going to try to be more attentive to the Holy Spirit and participate in what he might be leading me to do, to bring about that Eucharistic justice, know. I'd love to hear your thoughts. That sounds like it's kind of more your wheelhouse.
Yeah, I've thought about it, or, just again, maybe not in depth or like practically what it means, but like how, if the Eucharist is this feast for the world, like it should engage our posture for helping us connect with food insecurity or understand the world's hunger in ways that, propel us to act in ways that God is calling us to. Again, not everybody has the same passions and we're not all called to the same thing.
Right.
And so, but at the same time, I think, Scripture is replete with images of God feeding people miraculously,
Right.
and satisfying hunger. And so I think we minimize the Eucharist when we don't say that it should propel us to society's ills, or that it's just a me and Jesus moment.
Right.
But
Or it's
rather,
just a spiritual thing.
yeah, it's just a spiritual thing, but that it should compel us to act in ways, um, to feed the hungry. So yeah, I don't know. I didn't expect
Sorry.
no, it's good. It's good. And I need to, and I want to, and it's more of the curiosity and thinking, part of this podcast has helped me think through and reframe issues and how to resort, what I believe and how that might inform my being in the world. And it's easy to sit here and have the conversations. It's harder to
Right.
actually go out and actually engage the world in redeeming ways. And so, yeah, that's the continual wrestling for
Mhm.
me.
There's a great quote that I use in the book by like a Pentecostal missionary in
Mm,
Mozambique who was feeding hungry children every day. And more kept coming, and they kind of got beyond their sense of, okay, this is how many we can accommodate, you
mhm,
know. And she was praying one night and she had this vision of all these kids coming, and she was saying, this is too much. And Jesus shows up and he says, you give them something to eat. And he breaks off a piece of his side,
mm,
it becomes bread. And then he says, give them something to drink. And he pours a cup of blood from his side. And then he says, because I died, there will always be enough.
mm.
And she's not a sacramental, liturgical Anglican Christian, but
Right.
it was Jesus' body broken that translated very practically for her in her ministry of feeding the poor.
Mm.
That really animated her imagination, and I've been in love with that story ever since I heard it in college.
No, yeah. Now that you mention, I remember that story, and yeah, it is that we operate so often from a point of scarcity that I need to accumulate all that I can accumulate in order to be safe, versus whereas the Eucharist imagination might call us towards a place of abundance, that the community has what it's needed to feed the people, and yeah, trusting that God will provide the resources for us to engage in ways that He is calling us to.
Yeah, Lent is a little teeny tiny version of practicing that
Yeah.
every year, where you fast and you say, can I learn to go without in a small way?
Hmm.
And you give alms, can I practice giving more than I normally would want to?
Yeah.
And I think it is kind of that training in trust for God's abundance for others, not just for me, but through me,
Yeah.
God's abundance to others.
Um, yeah. And so the Eucharist as a training ground to help us engage, but it also, I think I, firmly believe that the Eucharist shapes how we relate at our own home tables. And so like for
Mm.
you, like how has the Eucharist maybe transformed how you relate at, your tables in your home or in others' homes, or, and how do you help others think through that?
Two things come to mind. The first of which is I want my children to grow up knowing that they are persons who belong.
Hmm.
They're not objects who meet my needs or do my bidding, although I
Yeah.
do often treat them that way. But at the table, we learn how to be human, how to be known and fed in the context of covenant and relationship and safety and belonging. But I also think that the Eucharist really compels us to then open up our family tables to our neighborhoods and to our communities, so that it's not just about me and my nuclear family or me and my roommates, but it's about who does Jesus want to bring to this table so that they too can experience that belonging and that inclusion and that nourishment. And
Mm.
so for me, the Eucharist has really shaped my sense of mission. And I think that's in part because that's what I experienced. I was that child who felt kind of on the outside
Mm.
of belonging and community, and at the Lord's table, at the table of church friends, I was kind of grafted in. And so I'm kind of like a firsthand beneficiary
Yeah.
of that mission. And I really believe that it can be world changing.
Mm. No, and I sometimes think too of like Richard Beck has influenced my ideas of hospitality a lot, and he talks about seeing Jesus in the other and like you know um, who might be Jesus for me in that moment, and so how to even
Mm,
have that posture of yes, I want to be Jesus to others or show them love or care and concern, and but how might they be Jesus to me in unexpected ways that they had no ideas they were.
mm,
um, and I wonder too, as we celebrate the Eucharist, how might Jesus show up in the unexpected ways in the stranger, that in us trying to minister to others, how might people minister to us in the unexpected.
right. Yeah, that gets back to what you were saying about the hospitality blurring
Right.
the lines between the host and the guest.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of times we think, "Oh, I'm gonna help that person
Right.
by including them at my table or doing this nice thing for them," and then often we're the ones who end up being blessed and being met by Christ, through that other person. I was just reading a story in a book by Scott McKnight who was talking about a woman in his church who was a nurse, and she volunteered to wash the feet of a patient that came in that were like really moldy and
Hmm.
just pussing. I mean, like a really severe situation. And it started out as like, oh, I think my Christian obligation should be to do this. And
Right.
as she was doing it, she started sobbing and looked up and into the person's eyes. And he was looking at her, and she said, and then I saw Jesus, there he
Hmm.
was. Um, and it turned into this really meaningful experience of her encountering God.
Right. And I think that's where the Eucharist trains our imagination, where we can begin to see Jesus in the unexpected, in the maybe even in the mundane. Um, you know, I subscribe to Diana Butler Bass's newsletter, and she wrote she coined this phrase "normalcy as resistance,"
Hmm.
where that maybe in our normalcy we actually may resist the evil forces
Mm.
around us. That maybe in our everyday eating and our extending fellowship, we might be forming communities of resistance more than we imagine than going out and protesting. Um,
I like that.
yeah, it really resonated with me just because of the fact of mundane eating and just this idea that, okay, what is my task? And I may not be able to, lead a protest, but I can still, sit down with my girls for dinner,
Right.
sharing the laughter there, or, meet with people, extend,
Hmm.
have people over that need encouragement.
Yeah.
Um, And so, for those people listening that may think, okay, this is all nice and good, but I have been deeply hurt by the church, and for me just to
Hmm.
go receive Jesus sounds too much.
Hmm.
What encouragement or past, where should somebody start who's feeling that way, thinking, hey, this sounds nice. I'm glad the Eucharist is this beautiful thing for you, but
Hmm.
I can't receive right now. Um, where might people start?
I think I would want them to start just with God's grief over that. Um, I remember reading the one of the many reports about the Catholic, um, sex abuse crisis, and not to pick on any denomination because
Right.
we all have them,
Yep.
but just being so grieved to think that for someone, the cross of Christ could be their trigger to their abuse was just really devastating. And I think that's only a small glimpse of how God feels
Hmm.
about that, how his name has been misused. And um, and wield it as a weapon against his children. So I think I would want to start just with permission to grieve, and to know that God grieves and is angry on your behalf.
Yeah.
Also, I think I would say patience, because God is with us. He's committed to us over the long haul of our stories, and a lot of things in our stories do not resolve quickly. I do think, some wounding happens in relationship and therefore can only be healed in relationship. And so at some point there is that challenge to take the risk.
Yeah.
Again. I've known personally that sometimes it can help to, maybe have a change of scenery. So a lot of times Christians have to switch traditions. Go to a church where the music is different and the decorations are different and the words are different. But where you can still be with God's people and hear his word and come to his table. And I think, I would encourage, I had a neighbor in my old town who was like, I don't know that I'm going to come back to church. And I was like, if you want to come to my church, walk in late, wear sunglasses, sit in the back row and leave before it's over. Like, you are welcome. I would say take the risk at the level you can withstand the challenge, and just know that God is with you in that.
No, I appreciate that word. And I, in the midst of a transition for me, I had to go to a different church, a church that I wouldn't have normally gone to, that was much more progressive, but small, and, and it was a healing moment, and friends went with us. Friends said, hey, if you want to check it out, we'll go with you. And that was a gift. They had been once before, they'd been a couple of times before. And so, finding somebody who might go with you and, be that support. Yeah. And hold you in that grief. Because, like you said, we're wounded in relationship, but many times our healing comes through relationship too. And so where are those relationships that might provide the security you need, or the safety, to risk again.
Yeah.
And so a question I ask all of my guests as we wrap up: what's the story you want the church to tell?
Wow, that's such a great question. I think I want the church to tell a story of hope, in the sense that not come to Jesus and all your problems are going to be resolved, but come to Jesus and he holds and sustains us until the day that he makes all things new. And also that he is trustworthy to hold us while we are broken and while we are still on the way, that we can come to him as we are, and that we can trust that a bruised reed he will not break, and a faintly burning wick he will not quench.
Oh, thank you for that word. It's always fun, interesting, sacred to hear people's responses, because I think in times it lines up with the nature of what we've been talking about, but also just expresses a heart, that, a desire that is very deep in people. So, and then a few fun questions about food to wrap up. What's one food you refuse to eat?
Oh, wow. This is going to be hard for me. I love food. I do not like brown avocados. I love green avocados, yes. But if they get, even a little bit of brown, I'm like, I can't do it.
That's fair.
I can't scoop around it.
Okay. Fair. Yes.
I'm sure there's more, but yeah, I do like most things. Yeah.
Then if you like most things, what's one of the best things you've ever eaten?
I mean, cheese is going to be too boring of an answer, but I do love cheese.
Okay,
just
well,
passionately.
okay. My first job in the restaurant was as a fromagier. So you and I love, I speak cheese. So like when you say cheese, I'm hoping you're not just meaning, Kraft singles
Sliced, right? Oh,
or
no,
sliced, Kroger cheddar, but like
right.
there's a deep, artisanal
Yeah.
cheese in your brain. And so like, do you have a favorite cheese or style of
Boy,
cheese?
a deep artisanal cheese in my brain. A favorite, that would be hard. I mean, I really love cheddar. I really love brie, goat cheese, blue cheese. I mean, I like stinky cheese.
Oh, yes.
I still remember the first time I had brie. I grew up in the South, and it was not exactly culinary fancy place. But I had some brie at a reception, and I was like, "What is this?"
Yeah.
And an adult told me it's a soft French cheese. And yeah, so I think, the more fat and the more odor on it is the better.
No, I fully agree. Epoisse is one of my favorite French cheeses. It's a stinky rind. Brillat Savarin, one of the great food writers of the 19th century, I believe, said it was the king of cheeses.
Oh my. I wonder if I've had that. I'm going to have to look it up.
Yeah. Or I think our Jasper Hill Farms, they're in the US, but they make this cheese and it's available at our Kroger, but it's like Harbison. It's a round, creamy cheese that's wrapped in spruce bark. That has a pungency that is delightful. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. A cheese and wine night is one of my wife and I's favorite. Like there's not much better than that.
That's right. Wow. Yeah. It's can kind of not be so great afterwards. But in the moment, it's
yes.
worth it.
Yes. And sometimes your fridge smells like cheese afterwards.
I can't eat cheese for dinner anymore. Yeah. But
yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
No, I once wrote, and as I was exposed to cheese, I wrote on the odoriferous nature of cheese and how like there's correlations. Like we don't like stinky cheeses, and what does that mean for our spiritual lives? And
oh, I want to read that.
Just because I'm thinking, it's like oftentimes we don't like the stink, but in the stink there's goodness. If we can get if we can move towards something beautiful, the complexity and the anyway. See, now you got me going.
That's great.
Yeah. And finally, there's a conversation among chefs about last meals, as in if you knew you only had one more meal left to enjoy, what would it be? So if Hannah had one last meal, what might be on her table?
Oh, wow. My last meal. Gosh, that's a tough one. I feel like I'm going to cry. Maybe Thanksgiving dinner.
Yeah.
Just like for sentimental reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah, my grandfather's about to die, but he fed us Thanksgiving dinner for so many years. And when I was like a college student living 1,000 miles away from home, I just remember getting on a plane and thinking about pie, at Thanksgiving, and just the comfort of those family recipes and all the calories, the dessert. I think that might be it. Thanksgiving dinner.
All right. Is there a recipe of your grandpa's that sticks out from Thanksgiving? Like you said pies, but
they have a corn casserole. The stuffing, it's not fancy. I remember asking for the recipe once and he was like, "Oh yeah, it's one of those boxes," Just when you grow up eating something, you just think this is the best ever.
Right.
They have like a marinated carrot salad and they do a cranberry orange relish. He and my grandmother have all these family recipes from both sides of their family,
right.
and they're not gourmet, but they're just special. Yeah.
Nope. Those special recipes, are what stay with us, and the stories, the memories they harken back to. again, it's a foretaste of
Yeah.
something more beautiful to bring it back to the Eucharist. So I really enjoyed this conversation, Hannah. If people want to learn more about your work, where can they find you?
My website is hannahmillerking.com, and there's a link there to my Substack. I write a monthly reflection. Also on my website are links to other things I've written for other outlets.
Awesome. Yeah, and do pick up the book, Feasting on Hope, How God Sets a Table in the Wilderness. It's published by InterVarsity. It's available now wherever you get your books, but hopefully from smaller book retailers and not the big bad evil, which we all buy from.
He who must not be named.
He who must not be named. So if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing it with others. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Biggest Table, where we explore what it means to be transformed by God's love around the table and through food. Until next time, bye.